They say the dead don't talk. But they do. You just have to listen long enough. Their voices ride on the wind, whispering through the cracks of old saloon doors, through the broken boards of forgotten towns. Not the voices of lawmen, not the ones they built statues for. No, these are the voices of the women they buried twice, once in the ground. And once in the story. They called them THIVES. But maybe. They were just women who refused to kneel. They came west chasing freedom, and found it guarded by men who thought they owned it. They crossed deserts with blistered hands and bleeding feet, holding on to hope like it was the last thing God forgot to take. Some came for gold, some for peace, some just to start again. But the West never gave without taking more. It took their names, their sons, their bodies, and still, they stayed. There was a woman who carried a pistol inside a Bible, because faith alone couldn't save her. Another who ran a gambling table better than any man, until the sheriff decided women weren't allowed to win. One married 6 men, outlived them all, and buried each with her own 2 hands. They called her cursed. She called it experience. There was one who shot a preacher for raising his hand at her child. They said she was godless. But she still prayed, only louder. And the ones who didn't kill, they endured. They sewed wounds, poured whiskey, dug graves, birthed children in cabins that smelled of smoke and regret. They listened to the world tell them they were less, and then proved it wrong with every breath they took. They had no laws to protect them, no songs to remember them, no pages to hold their stories. The men wrote the legends, the women lived them. And when the dust settled, it was the women who were left standing, sweeping the blood off the floor while history looked the other way. One woman ran messages for a gang that robbed trains not for greed, but because it was the only way to feed her sisters. Another nursed dying soldiers, then was thrown out when peace came because they said her hands were unclean. One was buried alive by her husband for daring to leave him, and they say she clawed her way back up, eyes full of dirt, heart full of rage. They didn't get justice. They got rumors. They didn't get mercy. They got erased. The world forgot their faces, their voices, their truths. But the land didn't. The wind still carries their names. You can call them sinners if it helps you sleep. You can call them dangerous if it makes you feel safe. But the truth is simple. They lived harder, burned longer, and loved fiercer than the world ever let them. They were punished for surviving. For walking into a man's world, and not asking permission. For breaking the rules that were never meant to protect them. They say the West was won by men. But the men died young. The women endured. And maybe endurance is the truest kind of victory. Most people will scroll past their stories just like the history books did. Don't be one of them. The West had a law that was never written down, a law that didn't need ink or paper, just judgment. It was the rule that said a man could sin and still be called strong, but a woman only had to breathe wrong to be called wicked. They said justice was blind, but out here, she could see just fine, and she always looked the other way when the guilty wore spurs instead of skirts. A man could rob a train, burn a town, steal a life, and they'd call him an outlaw, a legend, a story worth telling. But if a woman took a coin that wasn't hers, or a breath of freedom that wasn't given to her, they called her fallen, unnatural, a disgrace to her kind. They said the frontier was a place for the brave, but bravery had a gender. When a man raised a gun, it was courage. When a woman did it, it was madness. In the 1860s, they called it virtue, a word used like a rope, tight around the necks of women who didn't bow. There were laws made not to protect them, but to keep them small. If she wore the wrong dress, she was indecent. If she spoke too freely, she was dangerous. If she refused a man, she was hysterical. And if she fought back, she was criminal. A man could gamble his wages away, drown himself in whiskey, break his vows, and still be welcomed in church on Sunday. But a woman could wash his blood off her hands after he struck her, and they'd still call her the sinner. The papers wrote about the bad men of the frontier. They made them famous. They gave them names that echoed through time: Jesse, Billy, Butch. But when a woman broke the same laws, the headlines didn't call her brave. They called her shame, a fallen dove, a wayward soul, a female outlaw, unfit for redemption. They never asked why she stole, why she fought, why she ran, because the answer would have made them look in the mirror. There was no justice for women in the West, only expectation. Be quiet, be pure, be obedient, be whatever the world needs you to be, until it forgets you existed. And yet, they survived anyway. That was their real crime. To live without permission, to ride without asking, to hold their heads high in a world that demanded they crawl. One woman robbed a stagecoach after her husband spent their last dollar on drink. They called her a disgrace. Another carried a knife under her skirt to protect herself from men who called it flirting. They said she was wicked. One left her marriage, changed her name, and started over in another town, and they said she was lost. Lost to whom? To the men who never saw her as anything more than a body, to the world that punished her for wanting air to breathe. The truth is, every woman who broke the law out here wasn't breaking it for greed. she was breaking it to live. Because surviving as a woman in the West wasn't just hard, it was illegal. And the greatest sin she could commit was daring to outlive the rules written to keep her down. They said the West was a land of opportunity, but opportunity had a man's face and a man's name. The rest, the forgotten half, carved their freedom out of the silence, one rebellion, one breath, one sin at a time. History remembers the men who shot their way into legend, but it was the women who endured the kind of battles no bullet could end. They called them fallen, but maybe, just maybe, they were the only ones who ever truly stood. Her name was Myra May Belle Shirley, but the West didn't remember her that way. The West remembered the smoke, the pistol, the shadow she cast when she rode through the dust, and they called her Belle Starr, the bandit queen, the woman who dared to live louder than her time allowed. She was born into silk and manners, raised to curtsy and smile, the kind of girl the world expected to stay quiet, but quiet never fit her right. She had music in her bones, and rebellion in her blood. While other girls were learning hymns, Belle was learning how to ride, how to shoot, how to survive. When the war came, it tore everything she knew apart. The home, the peace, the promise. And when the smoke cleared, the world she came from was gone. She was left standing in its ashes, too proud to beg, too smart to starve, and too angry to stay still. They say every outlaw is born from a moment, one single betrayal that changes everything. Hers came with a smile. The man she trusted turned on her. The friends she helped ran. When the news came close, the law took what it wanted, and left her with nothing but a gun and her name. From that day on, Belle didn't ask permission to live. She rode with men who robbed banks and trains, not because she craved gold, but because she refused to crawl for bread. They said she dressed like a queen and rode like the devil. Maybe she did. Maybe that was the only way to survive a world that crowned men for sinning and buried women for the same. The papers called her dangerous, heartless, wicked. They painted her face on wanted posters beside men twice as cruel and half as brave. They said she lured men to ruin. They never said those men already lived there. Belle Starr became their favorite villain, not because she was the worst of them, but because she was the loudest proof that a woman could live without asking. Every headline was a warning disguised as entertainment. Don't be like her, don't stand too tall, don't ride too far, don't live too free. But Belle didn't listen. She rode anyway. She laughed at the law, mocked the sheriffs, and carried her pride like a loaded weapon. They called her a temptress. She called herself alive. The men who wrote about her said she seduced danger. What they didn't write was that danger came first, and it always wore a man's face. She lived on her own terms until the day someone took that choice from her. February the 3rd, 1889, found face down on a muddy road, shot in the back. No witnesses, no justice, no answers, just a name written in dust and whispered in taverns. Belle Starr, the bandit queen, killed like an outlaw, buried like a sinner, remembered like a myth. Her killer was never found, maybe because nobody cared, or maybe because some stories were never meant to end clean. They said she deserved it. They said it was fate. But if you listen close enough, you'll hear the truth whisper back. They just couldn't stand a woman who lived like she was free. Belle Starr's story Sholvey made her a hero, but the West didn't like women who didn't die quietly. If her story made you feel something, subscribe before it gets buried again. They said no woman ever robbed a stagecoach and lived to tell it. Then came Pearl Hart, the girl who made the West blush. She wasn't born an outlaw. She was born a daughter, a wife, a woman taught to say yes when she meant no. The world told her where to stand, how to smile, who to love, and she obeyed, until it broke her. Her husband drank her quiet, her country ignored her hunger, and one day, when there was nothing left to lose, she decided to stop asking for permission. In 1899, she cut her hair, stole a revolver, and saddled up beside a man named Joe Boot. The papers later called it scandal. She called it survival. Together they stopped a stagecoach outside Globe, Arizona. The passengers were frightened, the driver shaking, the sun burning hot enough to melt guilt. And then she smiled, calm, steady, almost kind. She didn't scream, she didn't threaten. She simply said, "Please step out. I need the money more than you." They handed it over. She gave one man a few dollars back, told him to buy dinner for his family. Then she rode away, leaving the West's pride bleeding in the dust behind her. When they caught her, they didn't know what to do. A woman with a gun didn't fit in their story. The sheriff didn't call her a criminal. He called her a curiosity. Reporters swarmed the jail like flies on sugar. They asked her why she did it. She told them the truth. "I was desperate, and I wanted to live free." That answer scared them more than any bullet could. The newspapers turned her into a joke, then a warning, then a legend. One headline called her the Lady Bandit. Another called her the Wildcat of the West. They printed her face, her smile, her story, over and over, until the real woman disappeared behind the myth they built. The men who robbed trains were called daring. The men who shot sheriffs were called brave. But when Pearl robbed a stagecoach with a pistol and a smile, they said she'd shamed the West itself. Because she didn't rob for greed, she robbed for freedom. In court, she stood there in her best dress, chin high, eyes calm. The judge asked if she felt remorse. She said, "I shall endeavor to make a better woman of myself, but I shall never be sorry for doing what I had to do." They sentenced her anyway, locked her in Yuma prison, a cage built for men, and made her their spectacle. But she didn't break. She joked with guards. She read novels. She dreamed of open roads and empty skies. 2 years later, she was gone, released quietly, or released too quietly. Some said she married a rancher under a new name. Some said she ran to Mexico and never looked back. Some said she was silenced for knowing too much, for being too loud. The truth vanished like smoke. Pearl Hart, the woman who robbed the West's pride, walked out of history one day, and never walked back in. No grave, no goodbye, no ending. Maybe she's still out there somewhere, riding through the dust free in all the ways the world said she couldn't be. She didn't rob for gold. She robbed for the right to exist on her own terms. And if that's a crime, then maybe the West was guilty long before she ever was. Pearl Hart's story should be made her immortal, but the West has a way of burying the women who embarrass it. If her story made you feel something, subscribe before it gets buried again. They called her the Thorn of the Wild Bunch, a flower too dangerous to touch. Her name was Laura Bullion, the only woman who rode with Butch Cassidy's gang, and the one they tried hardest to forget. She wasn't supposed to be there. The West had rules for women: cook, clean, marry, mourn, and die quietly. But Laura was born allergic to quiet. Her father was an outlaw, her uncle a thief, and by the time she could ride, she'd already learned that the world only respected the ones who took what it refused to give. They say she met the Wild Bunch when the wind was changing, when trains were faster, guns were sharper, and the law had begun to wear a civilized face. But under that civility still lived the same hunger, the same greed, the same need to control the ones who wouldn't kneel. Laura rode with men who were feared across the frontier: Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the rest of that reckless, laughing storm. But she wasn't their decoration. She was their equal. She robbed trains, forged notes, fenced stolen gold, and rode hard through gunfire with a cigarette in her teeth and a bounty on her head. The newspapers called her a wild beauty, but what they really meant was she scared them. A woman who could ride like a man, think like a criminal, and refuse to ask for permission. That wasn't a woman they could print without trembling. So they did what history always does to women who won't behave. They erased her. The law wrote her name out of the records. Reporters cropped her out of the photographs, even the wanted posters for the Wild Bunch. The ones that showed every man's face clear as daylight left her out entirely, as if she was never there, as if the West had to pretend its most dangerous outlaw wasn't wearing a dress. But she was there, in the saddle, in the smoke, in the legends whispered at campfires, when the lawmen weren't listening. They said she loved the Sundance Kid. They said she broke hearts and banks in the same breath. Maybe that's true, but what's truer still is that she loved freedom more than any man alive. And freedom never came cheap. When they finally caught her, she didn't beg. She smiled for the camera, soft eyes, steady hands, and a look that said, "You'll forget me if you can, but you won't." She served her time, walked out of prison, and disappeared into the quiet corners of the country she once set on fire. No one knows what became of her. Some say she changed her name. Some say she lived old and alone. Some say she never stopped looking over her shoulder, waiting for the legend to catch up. But the truth is, she never really left, because the story of the Wild Bunch still rides through the dust. And if you listen close enough, you can hear her horse among them. The only woman in a storm of men. The thorn they couldn't pull. They erased her from the photo but not from the legend. And if her story made you remember her name, then don't let it vanish again. Subscribe, and keep her ghost alive. Not every story has a name. Not every grave has a marker. The West was full of women whose faces were never printed, whose voices never made it past the dust. But they were there, in every town, every canyon, every place a man once swore was his alone. Some wore dresses, some wore boots. All of them wore ghosts. There was the woman who ran a brothel at the edge of a mining camp, not because she loved the work, but because it was the only way to keep the other women safe from the men who came drunk and desperate. They called her the Devil's Mother. She called herself the landlord of the lost. When she died, no preacher came. The girls buried her in the dark, and by morning, the world had already forgotten her name. There was a ranch hand who rode under a man's name for 10 years. She broke horses, fought rustlers, drank whiskey straight, and never once let the world see her hair. When she was shot by a thief, they found her secret too late, and wrote, "Unknown," on her headstone, because the truth embarrassed them more than her death. There was a bounty hunter. They said she never missed. Some claimed she'd been a widow. Others said she'd been a mother who lost everything. The wanted posters never showed her face, just the shadow of a hat, the hint of a gun, and a line that read, "No mercy, no past." One day, she vanished. Maybe she died. Maybe she finally ran far enough to live. The record books don't say. They never do. There were women who stitched clothes by day and stole horses by night. Women who rode through gunfire to rescue children that weren't theirs. Women who buried their husbands and took over the ranch when no man would lend a hand. Women who built towns, lit lamps, loaded rifles, and still got written out of every version of the story. The men got nicknames: Kid, Butch, Sundance, Doc. The women got silence, their names scattered like dust across the years. Too small, too inconvenient, too dangerous to remember. They said these women didn't matter, but the truth is, the West wouldn't have lasted a single winter without them. They cooked for dying miners. They patched bullet wounds. They planted crops in cursed soil, and prayed that rain would remember them. And when the wind came howling through ghost towns decades later, it wasn't the men's names it carried, it was theirs. Faint, fragile, still trying to be heard. Somewhere under the dust, there's a cross without a name, a dress half buried in the earth, a ring that never found its hand again. That's where the rest of them sleep, the women, who never made it into the legends, because the truth of them was too heavy for paper. Some were cruel, some were kind, some were broken beyond repair, but all of them, every single one, lived harder than they were ever allowed to. And maybe that's why history buried them deeper than the gold they chased, because remembering them means admitting the West wasn't just a land of heroes, it was a land of survivors. You know what's worse than dying? Being forgotten. Don't let them fade again. Subscribe, or at least say their names in the comments. The West didn't erase its women by accident, it did it on purpose. Every story that could have made them legends was rewritten by men with pens dipped in pride. Every photograph that showed them armed, unashamed, or alive was burned, cropped, or labeled improper. Somewhere in a courthouse basement, a ledger still breathes their names, half faded, half torn, buried under tax receipts and cattle records. But the headlines, the history books, they turned them into jokes, sinners, or ghosts. They made them villains because heroes weren't supposed to wear skirts. They made them whores because calling them warriors was too dangerous. They made them myths because the truth would have broken the story the West told about itself. Belle Starr wasn't just an outlaw, she was a strategist, ran safe houses, planned heists cleaner than any man, but the papers called her the Queen of Crime and drew her with a corset and a sneer. Hart wasn't a thief, she was a statement, a woman who robbed the symbol of everything that told her no, but Hollywood turned her into a cartoon, smiling and fluttering lashes while holding a toy gun. Bullion, the Thorn of the Wild Bunch, rode beside legends, but when the photos were printed, they erased her face. Said she'd distract from the narrative, as if truth itself was a man's invention. The archives call it damage, torn files, smudged ink, missing documents. But paper doesn't rot like that by accident. People made sure their names disappeared. Librarians were told not to catalog them. Teachers skipped the chapters that mention them. Museums locked their portraits in drawers labeled unverified. And then came the movies, the dime novels, the black and white fantasies that sold a West where women existed only to be saved or shamed. They rewrote the script until no one remembered the truth. The girls who rode shotgun became damsels. The gunfighters became love interests. The survivors became sinners. When the real history started to fade, they didn't rebuild it, they replaced it. They painted the women smaller, their guns lighter, their voices softer. And they called that accuracy. The silence wasn't an accident. It was architecture. Built by the men who knew that remembering them would change the story of everything. Because if the West admitted its queens, its builders, its thieves, its rebels, then it would have to admit it was never conquered by men alone. Somewhere out there, in the dust and the dark, the truth still waits in old letters, burnt photos, the corners of forgotten museums where no camera ever pans. But every time someone says their names, every time a story like this gets told again, a page rewrites itself. And that's how history starts to heal. They tried to burn their names. They forgot fire can't touch legend. They didn't set out to change the world, they were just trying to survive it. But sometimes survival is revolution. The women of the West didn't know their names would echo. They didn't know that every step they took through dust and danger would leave prints that led straight into the future. They weren't saints, and they weren't symbols. They were women who refused to kneel, who refused to let a man, a law, or a lie define what they were worth. And because of that, they became the ghostwriters of every rebellion that came after. The suffragists who marched decades later, they carried the same fire those outlaws lit. The ranch women, who held their land when banks came for it, they carried the same steel. The mothers who spoke out when silence was safer, they carried the same sin, the sin of wanting to live free. The bandit queen didn't know she'd become a symbol of defiance. Hart didn't know her smile would outlive her sentence. Bullion didn't know the photos that erased her would one day be searched for by girls who saw themselves in her absence. And the nameless ones, the ones who never made it past a line in an old sheriff's report, They didn't know they were building a map. A map for every woman who ever decided that fear wasn't a reason to stop. They didn't ask to be remembered. They just refused to be erased. And that's the difference between fame and legacy. History wrote them out, but they left behind something stronger than ink: proof. Proof that you don't need a crown to be a queen, or a monument to be immortal. All you need is a story that refuses to die quietly. And maybe that's the real inheritance they left us. Not gold, not land, not legend, but a lesson that power doesn't always roar. So if you've ever felt small, remember, so did they. If you've ever been told your story doesn't matter, remember, that's exactly what they were told too. And the only reason their stories died is because no one kept them alive. Be the one who does. Subscribe now. Keep them breathing. They buried their bodies, then they buried their names. But some ghosts don't rest easy. Out there, where the land still remembers blood and dust, the wind carries something heavier than silence. It carries the voices of those who refused to stay gone, the ones who never got their justice, their graves unmarked, their stories unspoken. The men wrote the endings, but the endings didn't hold, because truth doesn't die when the liars do. It waits. It waits in the dark and the dirt, in the forgotten corners of every town that pretends it was built by saints. And if you listen long enough, really listen, you'll hear them. The rustle of skirts in dry grass, the soft click of a revolver that never got fired, the whisper that sounds like breath, saying the words history was too afraid to print. We live too. They live through hunger, through laws that didn't see them, through towns that took everything and still called them sinners. They lived through being loved, used, and forgotten, and somehow, still found a way to matter. The West tried to bury them, tried to make the dust do its job, but legends have a way of clawing back through the dirt. Because some stories don't fade, they haunt. And the ghosts that haunt us aren't angry, they're patient, waiting for someone, anyone, to say their names again. Maybe that someone is you. Because if you heard that whisper, if something in you stirred when the wind moved through their graves, then you're part of the story now. The moment you remember them, they stop being ghosts. Don't just leave. Don't scroll past and let them die twice. Subscribe, because silence is how history wins. And tonight you broke the silence.